Joining me now is one of the finest thinkers of his generation, best-selling author Douglas Murray. Douglas, let's start in the Middle East, where the fragile ceasefire in Gaza has been shattered. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he authorised the renewal of military action against Hamas after their failure to release hostages or abide by the conditions of a US proposal to extend the ceasefire. This military action has been condemned by the likes of the Saudis, Qatar, Egypt, a number of countries in the region, all very predictable. But Douglas, Israel is also facing heavy criticism from France and Ireland and a number of other European countries. What do you make of that? What do you make of this refusal to from so many in the West to understand what Israel is facing right now?
Well, it's sort of par for the course, unfortunately. Hamas has repeatedly broken its side of the deals in the stage one of the ceasefire agreement. We saw that not least in its obscene handover ceremonies of Israeli hostages, including its obscene parading of the coffin of Israeli babies in front of jubilant crowds in Gaza the other week. On top of the war crimes that Hamas has committed by abducting and torturing and killing Israeli citizens, it's, of course, continued to commit war crimes during this phase of the ceasefire deal. Phase two of the ceasefire deal, by the way, has always been a problem because it requires Hamas to hand over all the remaining hostages, as they should have done on October the 8th, 2023. But it requires them to do so, and for Israeli troops to withdraw completely from the Gaza. Now, the problem for that is, of course, is that Hamas, although it's been significantly degraded, is, as we've seen from these obscene handover ceremonies, not completely destroyed in Gaza. And there is therefore a likelihood, an inevitability, that Hamas would continue to rule or misgovern the Gaza, which is intolerable to the Israelis because the Israelis had two stated war aims from the beginning of this war. Number one, to get back every hostage stolen from their homes by Hamas, and two, to destroy Hamas. And you just can't allow Hamas to remain in power. The Israelis can't. The various countries in the region condemn that is completely unsurprising. That's sort of what they have to say, even as in some cases they're urging Israel on. The fact that France would criticize Israel, among other Western countries, is also unsurprising, sadly. It'll be interesting to see next time France fights a war, when it does, whether it holds its army to the kind of accountability that the Israelis do theirs. My own observation of French military action in the Côte d'Ivoire and the Middle East and elsewhere is that they do exactly what they want and they don't listen to any international condemnation. So, sad as it is to say, perhaps the Israelis should ignore the French just as the French tend to ignore the world.
That's good advice there. I want to ask you about the Russian-Ukraine war. President Zelensky, we know, has accepted the US peace deal, and earlier today the White House released details of President Trump's discussions with Vladimir Putin. Douglas, Trump is pushing the Russians to agree to an unconditional ceasefire, but so far Putin has only ordered his military to adhere to a 30-day ceasefire on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Zelensky says he fears the Russians don't want an end to this war. Douglas, what do they have to gain by extending this mutually disastrous conflict?
Well, what Russia has to gain is that they will hope that Western support for Ukraine runs out or runs down, and that they can slowly, incrementally, whether or not during this presidency of Trump's or whether during a future presidency, continue their war and take over the whole of Ukraine as they tried to do in 2022. I mean, it's extremely hard with agreements with people like Putin. Not that there are that many, but we have quite a number of dictators in the world now, as always. It's hard to know what of their word you can trust, because the obvious thing is absolutely nothing. Zelensky is answerable not just to Western political alliances that are supportive of him, but is also, of course, has to be having the backing, the support in the end of the Ukrainian public and indeed the Ukrainian army who are fighting on. Whereas Putin doesn't really have to have anyone's support. It's just himself, his own view, along with a small number of people who are around him. And so then, you have this sort of thing of, well, what of Putin's word can you trust? And I don't think anyone who's ever dealt with him or ever seen the way he deals would think that you can trust Putin very much. The promise not to attack energy and other infrastructure is not a very useful promise from Vladimir Putin, given that it's one that he's given only within recent weeks and promptly done exactly what he said he wouldn't do. He gave another assurance some time ago that the Russians would not attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And then the next night, actually, whilst I was there, they did exactly that. So it's extremely hard. President Trump is trying to negotiate a final peace, and I think should be admired, acknowledged for doing so. But it's an extremely difficult deal to pull off, and we'll see.